Hey guys, tonight we are going to take a little trip back in time. Not to a grand palace or a famous battlefield, but to a place far quieter and in some ways far more unsettling. We're heading to the small, isolated towns of 19th century New England. Imagine crisp, cold air, the scent of wood smoke, and a silence so deep you can hear your own heartbeat. This is a world lit by candles and firelight, a world where the forest feels ancient and alive, and your neighbors know everything about you. And a little heads up, if you get too attached to your character in this story, you might be in for a rough time. The life expectancy isn't fantastic, and as you'll soon discover, people's ideas about public health can get creative. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's always a pleasure to see our little community grow. And while you're at it, I'd love for you to drop a comment below telling me what city you're in and what time it is for you right now. It's fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from late-night listeners in London to early birds in Los Angeles. It makes our corner of the internet feel a bit cozier. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is the air. It's sharp and clean, with a distinct, earthy smell of damp soil, fallen leaves, and the faint, reassuring scent of wood smoke curling from a distant chimney. You're standing on a muddy, rutted track that politely calls itself a road. On either side, endless, low stone walls snake across the landscape, disappearing into clusters of stark, grey-barked trees. These aren't the grand, mortared walls of a castle. They're a testament to pure, back-breaking labor. This is one of the most surprising little details about this place. These iconic New England stone walls were built by generations of farmers, who year after year had to clear their fields of the seemingly infinite supply of rocks deposited by ancient glaciers. Every single stone you see was once an obstacle to survival, pulled from the earth by hand or with the help of an ox. They are, in a way, monuments to stubbornness. You pull your rough wool coat tighter. It's not winter yet, but the chill has a way of seeping into your bones. The world here feels smaller. Your world is the small town, a cluster of simple, unpainted clapboard houses, a white steep-led church, a general store, and the ever-present graveyard on the hill. News travels at the speed of a horse, and a letter from relatives back in Europe can take months to arrive, if it arrives at all. Your life is governed by the seasons and the sun. You wake before dawn, your breath misting in the cold air of your small home. The day is a cycle of demanding physical tasks: chopping wood, tending to the livestock, mending fences, churning butter, preparing food for the coming winter. There's a quiet satisfaction in this self-sufficiency. You don't just pop to the shop so your own two hands, a well-stocked pantry, and a prayer that the winter isn't too brutal. The social hub of this world is, without a doubt, the church. On Sunday, the whole town gathers. You sit on a hard wooden pew, listening to a sermon that speaks of providence, of God's mysterious will, and of the constant, looming presence of sin and salvation. But the real community connection happens after the service on the church. Here, news is exchanged, gossip is traded in hushed tones, and the health of your neighbors is discussed with genuine concern. Did you hear about the Miller boy? Still has that cough. Sarah looks awfully pale. Don't you think everyone is intertwined? A tragedy for one family is a tremor felt by all. This deep-seated community bond is both a comfort and a source of pressure. It means you are never truly alone in your struggles. But it also means you are always being watched, your life quietly assessed and judged against the community's unwritten rules. Historians and sociologists still debate the core psychological state of people in these isolated communities. Was it a life defined by unwavering faith and rugged resilience? Or was it a state of pervasive, low-grade anxiety, born from the constant struggle against nature, the profound isolation, and the ever-present reality of sudden, inexplicable death? Perhaps it was both, a delicate balance between stoic acceptance and a quiet, simmering fear of the unknown. Tonight, you're about to see that balance begin to tip. For now, though, as dusk settles, you watch the warm, flickering lights of candles appear in the windows of the houses. It's a peaceful scene. But a subtle, unspoken tension hangs in the air, as thin and sharp as the autumn chill. Something is coming. That quiet, simmering fiery feeling, it doesn't have a name yet, but it has a sound. It's a soft, persistent cough coming from the corner of the room where a young woman sits by the fire. At first, you and everyone else in the family dismiss it. A simple cold, a tickle in the throat from the dry, smoky air inside the house. You offer her a warm drink with honey. She smiles, thanks you, and assures everyone she's fine, but the cough lingers. A week passes then too. It becomes a part of the household soundscape, a soft, rhythmic punctuation to the day's activities. Then other signs begin to appear, so subtle at first that you almost convince yourself you're imagining them. She seems more tired than usual, content to sit and watch rather than join in the mending or the cooking. Her cheeks, once pale from the New England pallor, now have a delicate, rosy flush. In the flickering candlelight, her eyes seem brighter, almost luminous. She's losing weight, but so slowly that you only notice it in the way her dress hangs a little looser, the way her collarbones seem more pronounced. This right here is the true monster of our story. It's not a creature of the night, it's a sickness known as consumption. We call it tuberculosis today, but they called it consumption because that's exactly what it did. It consumed a person slowly from the inside out. It was the leading cause of death in the 19th century, a silent, creeping plague that infiltrated the one place you were supposed to be safe, your own home. And here's a bizarre little twist for you. For a time, especially in more artistic circles, consumption was almost romanticized. The symptoms, the pale skin, the flushed cheeks, the feverish, bright-eyed intensity were seen as signs of a delicate, sensitive, and passionate nature. It was considered a beautiful way to die, imbuing its victims with a tragic, poetic grace. It's a deeply unsettling thought, that a society could aesthetize a disease that was actively devastating it. But it speaks to how desperate people were to find some meaning, any meaning, in the face of something they called a control. Back in your small rural town, however, there's nothing romantic about it. You just see a loved one fading away. The family's mood shifts from dismissal to a quiet, gnawing worry. The cough deepens, becoming wet and dragging. Sometimes after a particularly bad fit, she'll pull her handkerchief away and you'll see it, the telltale, terrifying speck of bright red blood. Now, the fear is no longer simmering. It's a cold, hard knot in your stomach. The disease's most cruel trick is its pattern. It thrives in close, poorly ventilated quarters exactly like the small, shared air homes of the time. It passes from person to person through tiny droplets in the air, released by a cough or a sneeze. But you don't know this. You don't know about bacteria or germs. All you know is that once consumption enters a house, it often doesn't leave until it has did everyone. Historians still debate just how much the average person understood about its contagiousness. They certainly recognized that it ran in families, but their interpretation of that fact was tangled up in a web of different beliefs. Was it an inherited weakness of the bloodline? Was it caused by bad air or miasma rising from the damp ground? Or was it, as the Sunday sermon might suggest, a form of divine judgment? This confusion is key. They saw the pattern: one person sickens, then another, but they didn't have the scientific framework to understand the cause. To you, watching this unfold, it doesn't look like a disease being passed around. It looks like a curse. It looks like one person's life force is somehow being drained away, and that weakness is spreading to others. Weeks turn into months. The young woman is now confined to her bed. The rosy flush is gone, replaced by a waxy pallor. Her breathing is shallow. The family's life now revolves around her sickbed, taking turns sitting with her, spoon-feeding her broth, wiping her brow. The house is perpetually quiet, steeped in a heavy atmosphere of grief and helplessness. You watch the person you knew disappear, replaced by a frail, skeletal stranger. And one cool morning, just as the sun is rising, the coughing stops. The ragged breathing ceases. There is only silence. The first member of your family has been consumed. The silence in the house is a physical presence. It's heavier than any blanket, colder than any winter wind. The empty bed in the corner is a gaping wound in the fabric of your daily life. Every routine is now a reminder of who is missing. There's an extra space at the dinner table, an unused shawl on its peg by the door, a mending basket left untouched. This is when you truly understand the role of the family in this world. It's not just a social unit, it's the fundamental building block of survival, an economic and emotional fortress against a harsh and unforgiving world. Your family is a self-contained little corporation. The men handle the heavy labor plowing the fields, felling trees, building and repairing. The women manage the domestic sphere, a kingdom of its own that is no less demanding. They are responsible for turning raw materials into life, spinning wool into yarn, churning milk into butter and cheese, preserving summer's harvest for the long winter, making clothes, tending the kitchen garden. And, of course, raising the next generation, a purpose. The loss of a single member, especially a young adult, isn't just an emotional blow, it's a practical crisis. Who will take up their share of the work? The entire delicate ecosystem of the household is thrown off balance. Now, you have to prepare for the funeral, and this process is deeply intimate. You don't call a funeral home. You, the family, handle everything. The women of the house gently wash the body and dress it in its finest clothes, often the deceased's own wedding dress or suit. The men, with the help of a neighbor skilled in carpentry, build the coffin right there in the yard. You can hear the saw, the hammer, stark, rhythmic sounds that cut through the quiet grief. And here's a little custom that might seem strange to us: the sitting up or wake. The body isn't whisked away. It remains in the house, usually in the parlor, for a day or two before the burial. Family, friends, and neighbors come to pay their respects. They sit in the room with the deceased, sometimes all through the night. This wasn't just about mourning. It served a practical purpose. In an era before modern medical certification of death, the wake was a final, communal confirmation that the person was truly gone and not in some deep coma. There are folk tales from the period about people waking up during their own wakes, the testament to how real this concern was. During the wake, you sit in the dimly lit parlor, the air thick with the scent of beeswax candles and maybe some herbs tucked into the coffin to mask other odors. People speak in hushed tones, sharing memories of the departed. They bring food, pies, baked beans, fresh bread, because they know the grieving family is in no state to cook. This is the community in action, wrapping itself around the bereaved, offering comfort through presence and practicality. The concept of a good death is paramount. A good death was one that happened at home, surrounded by family, with time to repent one's sins and say goodbye. It was a peaceful transition, an acceptance of God's will. You tell yourself that your loved one had a good death. You have to believe it. It's the only narrative that makes the pain bearable. But as you look at the faces of your other family members gathered in the flickering light, you see the shadows of fear in their eyes. They are thinking the same thing you are. Was it just God's will, or is there something else at work here? Historians studying letters and diaries from this period often note the deeply intertwined nature of family and faith. A person's identity was almost entirely defined by their family role: son of, daughter of, wife of. When that structure was threatened, it felt like the entire world was coming apart. The question of why this happened becomes desperate. And while the church provided the official answer, divine providence, the human mind, especially when gripped by fear and grief, often searches for a more tangible culprit, a more direct cause for its suffering. Right now, your family's fortress has been breached. The loss is a crack in the foundation, and you can't shake the feeling that the crack is spreading. The grief is still raw, but life, with its relentless demands, has to go on. The cows still need milking, the firewood still needs chopping. And a new, urgent question begins to dominate the hushed family conversations. Who's next? You start watching your other siblings, your parents, even yourself, for any sign of the dreaded cough. Every clearing of the throat sends a small jolt of anxiety through the household. It's in this climate of fear that you decide to do what any sensible person of the time would do. You send for the doctor. Don't picture a man in a white lab coat with a stethoscope. The doctor who arrives at your door after a long ride on horseback is a respected figure in the community, but his medical knowledge is estranged to our modern eyes, terrifying cocktail of ancient theory, folk wisdom, and a few nascent scientific ideas. He carries a leather bag filled with the tools of his trade, vials of powders, jars of tinctures, and most importantly, his lancets and bleeding bowls. He enters the house with a somber, professional air. He'll listen to your concerns, nod gravely, and then begin his examination. He might press an ear to someone's chest, trying to discern the sound of the lungs, but his primary diagnostic framework is based on a theory that dates back to ancient Greece, the four humors. The idea is that the body is composed of four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health is the result of these humors being in perfect balance. Sickness is a sign of an imbalance. The cure, therefore, is to rebalance them. And the most common way to do that: bloodletting. The doctor might explain that there's too much bad blood, or that the blood has become stagnant and needs to be thinned. He'll take out a small, sharp knife called a lancet, make a swift incision in a vein, usually in the arm, and let a prescribed amount of blood drain into a shallow bowl. He might even use leeches, which he'll apply to the skin to do the job more gently. As you watch a family member's precious blood flowing away, a part of you feels a flicker of hope. This is action. Something is being done. But another part of you feels a deep unease. Is making a weak person even weaker really the answer? If bloodletting isn't his chosen path, he might prescribe some heroic medicine. This usually involved powerful purgative enzymatic substances designed to make you vomit or have severe diarrhea. The goal was to violently purge the body of whatever was causing sickness. A popular choice was a compound called calomel, which was mercury chloride. It definitely caused a dramatic physical reaction, but it was also a potent poison, leading to tooth loss, neurological damage, and kidney failure. You're essentially trying to poison the illness out of the body without poisoning the patient to death. It's a fine line. Here's a curious detail that reveals the state of their medical understanding: the stethoscope. It was actually invented in 1816, but for decades, many royal doctors either didn't have one or didn't trust it. They preferred the old way of putting their ear directly to the patient's chest. Some male doctors, however, felt it was improper to place their head so close to a female patient's bosom, so they would either skip that part of the exam or try to listen through a handkerchief, rendering it useless. The reluctance to adopt a simple, revolutionary tool because of social modesty shows just how much medicine was still intertwined with culture and tradition. The doctor eventually packs his bag, leaving you with a few packets of bitter powders and some strict instructions. You pay him not with cash, but more likely with a chicken, a sack of potatoes, or a promise of labor on his farm. You've put your faith in the most advanced science of your day. But as the weeks pass, and another family member starts to cough, a dreadful realization dawns. His bleeding bowls, his confident pronouncements, none of it is working. Historians are still debating the precise impact of 19th century medicine. Did it do more harm than good in many cases, like the overuse of mercury or excessive bloodletting on an already weakened patient? The answer is likely yes. But doctors also provided immense psychological comfort. Their presence represented hope and authority. They were a bulwark against pure superstition. But what happens when that bulwark fails, when the man of science, the figure of rational authority, throws up his hands and admits there's nothing more he can do? You're left in a terrifying vacuum. And into that vacuum, older, darker ideas are about to rush in. With the doctor's remedies failing and the sense of dread growing deeper, the nights in your small house become longer and quieter. The fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. The conversation, once focused on crops and community gossip, now drifts into a different territory. This is when the old stories start to surface, whispered in the flickering firelight. These aren't just local ghost tales, they are the collected fears of the old world, carried across the Atlantic in the minds of immigrants from England, Ireland, Scotland, Germany, and beyond. New England in the 19th century wasn't a monolithic culture. It was a melting pot of different European traditions, and each group brought its own rich folklore of ghosts, ghouls, and things that go bump in the night. The stories are told not as idle entertainment, but as cautionary tales, as half-believed explanations for the world's misfortunes. Your grandmother, her voice slow and raspy, might recall a story from her village in the old country about a man who, after death, was seen walking the lanes at night. Shortly after, his own children began to waste away, growing pale and weak, as if their very life was being sipped from them. Someone else might chime in with a German tale of the Nachzehrer, the after-devourer. This wasn't a creature that rose from the grave to bite necks. It was far more insidious. The Nachzehrer remained in its grave, but it could magically consume the life force of its living relatives from a distance. The signs were clear: strange shrouds, eating sound coming from the grave, and the slow, inexplicable decline of the family. The only cure was to dig up the corpse, find it unnaturally fresh, and disable it, often by placing a coin in its mouth or decapitating it. You listen to these stories, a chill running down your spine that has nothing to do with the draft from the windows. These aren't fantastic tales of caved counts in faraway castles. They are grim, practical stories about familiar landscapes and familiar fears. They are about farmers, villagers, and families, people just like you. The details resonate with a terrifying clarity. A wasting sickness that defies explanation, a family that sickens and dies off one by one. It sounds exactly like what is happening to you. Here's a fascinating little bit of linguistic trivia for you. The word vampire itself didn't really enter the English language in a big way until the early 18th century, brought back by travelers and soldiers from Eastern Europe. Before that, English folklore had plenty of accounts of the shroud eater or the restless dead, but the specific, named concept of the vampire was a relatively recent import. By the 19th century, it had mingled with older, local beliefs to create a unique, homegrown monster. This New England vampire was the suave aristocrat. It was your recently deceased aunt, uncle, or sibling. The power of these stories lies in their explanatory force. They offer a cause and effect narrative for something that seems random and cruel. The Doctor's humor-based theories are too abstract. The Church's explanation of God's will feels too passive, offering no course of action. But the story of a restless corpse actively draining the life from its family that suggests an agent, a culprit. And if there's a culprit, there might just be a solution, a way to fight back. The academic world still argues about the precise transmission of these folk beliefs. Was it a direct, unbroken chain of oral tradition from Europe? Or were these ideas constantly being reinvented and adapted to fit new circumstances? It was likely a bit of both. The core concepts, the malevolent dead, the draining of life, the desecration of the corpse, as a cure, were ancient seeds of folklore. The fertile ground of fear, grief, and medical ignorance in New England was the perfect place for them to sprout. As the fire burns low and the family retreats to bed, these stories linger in your mind. You lie under your quilt, listening to the wind howl outside and the unsettling cough from the next room. The line between reality and folklore begins to blur. The world of medicine and reason has failed you. The world of faith offers comfort but no answers. Now, the world of dark superstition is presenting itself as a practical guide to survival. You try to dismiss the thought, to cling to reason, but the seed has been planted. What if the problem isn't in the air you breathe, but in the ground just outside the church? It's not long before the second cough turns into the second wasting sickness. This time it's a younger brother. He was strong and healthy just a few months ago, working beside you in the fields. Now, he can barely lift his head from the pillow. The progression of the disease feels faster this time, more aggressive. The brief hope brought by the doctor has evaporated, replaced by a grim, suffocating certainty. You are simply watching the inevitable unfold again. The day comes. The house is once more plunged into that heavy, profound silence. The community rallies around you again, but this time, their sympathy is tinged with something else: fear. Your family is becoming a source of communal anxiety. People look at you with pity, but also with a kind of morbid curiosity, as if your house is marked by a terrible curse. The rituals of death begin again, but the atmosphere is different. The first funeral was steeped in pure, unadulterated grief. This second one is shadowed by a creeping dread, a sense of a pattern emerging. As you and your father build the second coffin in the yard, the sounds of the hammer and saw feel less like a solemn duty and more like a surrender. You are building a monument to your own helplessness. The wake is held. Neighbors file in undoubt, their voices even more hushed than before. They avoid looking too closely at the other family members, as if afraid to see the first signs of the sickness on them. The food they bring feels less like an offering of comfort and more like a ward against the bad luck that seems to cling to your home. Finally, the day of the funeral arrives. It's a grey, overcast day, the sky the color of slate. The entire community follows the simple, horse-drawn cart that carries the coffin up the hill to the graveyard. The graveyard, or burial ground, is a central feature of any New England town, a constant and visible reminder of life's fragility. The headstones are simple slabs of slate or granite, carved with a winged skull or a somber cherub, symbols not of horror, but of mortality and resurrection. You stand by the newly dug grave, a raw rectangular wound in the earth. The soil is rocky and hard to dig. The minister reads from the Bible, his words about dust returning to God meant to be a comfort. But, as you listen, your eyes drift across the other headstones. You see the names of your neighbors of other families who have also lost multiple members in quick succession. The Wilsons, who lost 3 children in a single winter. A husband and wife gone within a year of each other. You realize your family's tragedy is not unique. This place is full of similar stories. The coffin is lowered into the ground. You and the other men of the family take up shovels. The sound of the first clods of earth hitting the wooden lid is hollow and final. With each of a lefuel, you are burying your brother, your hope, and a little more of your family's spirit. One of the strange and perhaps merciful aspects of 19th century burial practices was their speed. Embalming was not yet a common practice, especially in rural areas. Decomposition began quickly, so funerals and burials usually happened within 2 or 3 days of death. There was no long, drawn-out period of mourning before the final farewell. It was swift and stark. This practicality, however, would have a profound and unintended consequence in the events to come. The state of the body, just a few days after burial, was a key piece of evidence for those hunting for the unnatural. As you pat down the last of the soil on the grave mound, you look over at the other fresh grave nearby, the one belonging to the first family member who died. They lie just a few feet apart. It's a peaceful pastoral scene. 2 siblings, side by side in the family plot. But in your mind, a new and terrible thought is taking shape, fueled by the whispered fireside stories. It's no longer a pastoral scene. It's a scene of proximity. One is dead. The other is now dead. Sleeping peacefully, or is one of them not at rest? Is one of them the source of the sickness, reaching out from the cold earth to claim the next? Historians who study burial practices argue about the psychological function of the graveyard. Is it a place to remember the dead, or a place to contain them? To ensure they stay where they belong for you, right now? That distinction is becoming critically important. You walk away from the grave, leaving your brother in the silent earth. But you can't shake the feeling that you are leaving a predator in the midst of its prey. The family fortress has not only been breached, the enemy is now inside the walls, buried right alongside you. You return from the graveyard to a house that feels emptier and colder than ever before. 2 empty chairs, 2 silent voices. The fortress of your family is crumbling, stone by stone. The rhythm of daily life is broken, stuttering along in a haze of grief and exhaustion. The remaining family members move like ghosts, performing their chores with a mechanical listlessness. The shared meals are silent, heavy affairs, the food tasteless. And then it begins. A third person starts to show the signs. Maybe it's your older sister, the one who spent the most time caring for the first 2. Or perhaps it's your father, his strong frame seeming to shrink day by day. It starts, as it always does, with the cough. That small, innocuous sound that now holds the power of a death sentence. When you hear it, your blood runs cold. This is no longer a coincidence. This is a pattern. A relentless, deliberate sequence. The idea of a family weakness or a bad air in the house starts to feel utterly inadequate to explain this systematic destruction. One by one, it feels like something is hunting you. The community's reaction shifts again. Pity is replaced by a palpable fear. Your neighbors are still kind, but they keep their distance. They no longer drop by for a casual chat. When you go to the general store, conversations might halt until you've collected your goods and left. Your children might be shunned in the schoolyard. Your family is now actively feared, as if you are carriers of a moral stain, a spiritual sickness that might be contagious. You are becoming isolated, quarantined not by medical decree but by social consensus. This isolation only deepens your family's paranoia and despair. Inside the house, the atmosphere becomes toxic. The grief is still there, but it's now mixed with suspicion and a frantic search for answers. You find yourself watching everyone, everything. Did this start when you moved the bed to that corner? Was it something in the water from the well? Did someone bring a cursed object into the house? Rational explanations become more and more far-fetched as you grasp at any straw that might explain the horror unfolding. The third victim's decline is a grimly familiar spectacle. The wasting away, the feverish eyes, the blood on the handkerchief. You know the stages by heart now. You are an expert in the geography of death. You know exactly how this story ends. The helplessness is the worst part. You are trapped in a nightmare, forced to watch the same terrible final act play out over and over again. Here's a detail about consumption that made it particularly terrifying: its variable timeline. While some people wasted away in a matter of months, others could live with a chronic, low-grade version of the disease for years, experiencing periods of relative health followed by relapse. This is known as a latent infection. To a 19th century family, this looked like the curse was biding its time, ebbing and flowing with a terrifying, supernatural intelligence, while another is taken swiftly. This randomness defied all logic, making it seem like the work of a capricious, malevolent force. As the third family member weakens, the whispered fireside stories from your grandmother no longer seem like folklore. They sound like a diagnosis. The story of the Nachzera consuming its family from the grave doesn't sound like a fairy tale anymore. It sounds like a literal description of your reality. The belief that the dead could envy the living and wish them ill was not a fringe idea. It was a deeply embedded folk concept. The dead weren't always seen as peaceful, benevolent spirits. They could be jealous of the warmth of the sun, the taste of food, the companionship of family. This jealousy could curdle into a malevolent hunger, a desire to pull their loved ones into the cold grave with them. Historians of religion and folklore often debate whether this was a true belief or a psychological projection, a way for the living to cope with the guilt of surviving while others died. Was it easier to believe your dead sibling was malevolent lie attacking you than to confront the random, senseless cruelty of disease? Whatever the academic conclusion, for you in this moment of profound crisis, it feels viscerally real. A third death arrives. The rituals are performed again, but they feel like a hollow mockery. The minister's words ring false. How can this be God's? Well, it feels like the will of something far older and far darker. As you stand over the third fresh grave in the family plot, you look at the 3 mounds of earth, lined up in a neat tragic row. The rational part of your mind is screaming that this is just a terrible disease. The part steeped in ancient fears and fueled by unbearable grief sees something else. It sees a predator and its victims. It sees a source and its targets. The community shuns you. The doctor has failed you. The church has no answers. Your family is being erased from the earth. The time for passive acceptance is over. The time for desperate measures has come. The third burial is the breaking point. The levee of reason, already weakened by waves of grief and fear, finally shatters. You return home not to mourn, but to a silent, tense family council. You all gather in the main room, the 3 empty places at the tables screaming louder than any words. The air is thick with unspoken thoughts. Finally, your father, or perhaps a grim-faced uncle, says it out loud. The doctor can do nothing. Prayer has done nothing. We cannot simply sit here and wait to die. The words hang in the air, releasing a tension that has been building for months. The unspeakable has been spoken. This is about survival, by any means necessary. The conversation that follows is low and furtive. The official channels have been exhausted. Now, you turn to the unofficial ones, the knowledge that lives in whispers and folklore. You recall the doctor's last visit. After the second death, you had summoned him again in a final, desperate plea. You can picture him now, standing in this very room, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He had looked at the patient, shaken his head slowly, and packed his leather bag of useless remedies. He might have muttered something about a hereditary taint or the family's constitution. He had no more answers. He offered no more answers. The representative of 19th century science and rational thought had effectively abandoned you. This abdication of the expert is a crucial turning point. As long as the doctor, the man of learning, had a plausible even if incorrect theory in the course of action, even if ineffective, your family could cling to the established order of things. You could tell yourselves you were doing everything right. But when the expert admits defeat, he creates a power vacuum. Into this void rushes the folk knowledge that has been simmering beneath the surface. The stories about the restless dead, once told as spooky tales around the fire, are now discussed as practical fact. Old Man Hemlock's family had the same trouble back in 9, someone might say. They wasted away, one after the other, until they did what had to be done. What had to be done is the focus of the hushed, urgent debate. The logic, twisted as it is laid out. The sickness is not a sickness, it's a draining. Something is feeding on the vitality of the living. Since the draining began after the first family member died, the source must be that first decedent. They are the bridge between the living and the dead, pulling their coin on the dead, pulling their cane across one by one. The evidence is clear the family was healthy, then one person died, and now the rest are following. It's a simple, terrifying, and internally consistent logic. Here's a curious piece of this folk belief system. It often required a specific type of person to be the expert. Since the official doctor was useless, the community would turn to a wise woman or a folk healer. Sometimes this was an older person who had a reputation for knowing traditional remedies, and other times it was someone associated with the church. But in an unofficial capacity. Even more bizarrely, sometimes the community would consult a quack doctor, a traveling charlatan who, unlike the licensed physician, was more than willing to diagnose a supernatural cause if it meant a hefty fee. There are historical accounts of these folk experts being called in to officially confirm the family's suspicions. The debate in your home isn't about if this is happening, but about what to do. The proposed solution is horrifying, a violation of every religious and social taboo you have been taught to respect. It involves shovels, a dark night, and the desecration of a loved one's grave. You can see the conflict etched on everyone's faces. On one hand, there is the profound horror of disturbing the dead. The minister has always preached that the body rests in sacred ground, awaiting the resurrection. To disturb a grave is a sacrilege. It's a peasant superstition, something that people in the ignorant old country did, not enlightened Americans. But on the other hand, another child is starting to cough. Your remaining sister looks pale. You yourself feel a constant weary ache in your bones. Is it sickness, or just fear you can't tell anymore? The instinct for self-preservation is a powerful primal force. It can override years of religious teaching and social conditioning. The choice is stark. Do you adhere to your principles and watch your entire family be extinguished? Or do you commit a terrible, sacrilegious act in the desperate, slim hope that it might save the ones who are left? The final decision is a collective one, a grim consensus born of utter desperation. Historians are still debating the social dynamics of such a decision. Was it driven by one charismatic, forceful family member, or was it a true group psychosis? Where shared fear erodes individual reason, it was likely a combination. In the end, it doesn't matter. You will do it. You will open the graves. The decision, once made, hangs heavy in the air, a secret that binds you and your family in a new, terrifying conspiracy. You don't speak of it during the day. You go about your chores, your face a mask of normalcy, avoiding the eyes of your neighbors. But you know they are watching. The community's suspicion, which was once a source of pain, now becomes a practical problem. You cannot be seen. This act must be shrouded in darkness and secrecy. The planning happens in hushed whispers after the sun goes down. Who will be part of the party? It will be the men of the family, your father, your uncles, perhaps a few trusted male cousins. This is seen as men's work, too grim and shocking for the women. Though in some historical accounts, the matriarch of the family was the one who insisted on the act and directed the proceedings, a testament to her desperation. The conversation turns to logistics. When should it be done? A moonless night would be best. You'll need shovels, picks to deal with the stubborn, rocky soil, and a lantern. It's like carefully hooded so it can't be seen from the road or nearby farms. There's a debate about which grave to open. The logic of the folk belief is clear: the first to die is the prime suspect. They are the root of the problem. However, some might argue that you should check all the recent dead, just to be sure. The fear of making the mistake of choosing the wrong grave and allowing the true vampire to continue its work is immense. It's in the quiet moments, as you lie in bed waiting for the chosen night, that the full weight of what you are about to do presses down on you. The graveyard on the hill, once a place of solemn remembrance, now looms in your imagination as a place of dread. The stories you heard as a child now have a sharp, menacing edge. You think about the minister's sermons on the sanctity of the grave and the promise of resurrection. You are about to defy all of that. You are taking matters into your own hands, stepping into a realm of magic and ritual that the church condemns as paganism. The gossip that fuels this decision is a powerful force. Imagine a conversation taking place over a fence line between two neighbors. "Heard the Browns lost another one might say." The other shakes his head. "Just like the Smiths down the river, they kept dying till they took care of it." "Took care of it," how the neighbor leans in closer, his voice dropping. "They dug up the first one. Found him, fresh. As if he'd been put there yesterday, heart full of blood." This is how the cure is transmitted. It's not written in any book. It's a viral piece of information, passed from one desperate family to another. A fascinating and weirdly specific detail of this folklore is the test to determine if a corpse is a vampire. One of the most common beliefs was that a true vampire, when exhumed, would not show the expected signs of decay. The body would be plump or fresh, the limbs still flexible. Crucially, the internal organs, particularly the heart and liver, would be found to contain liquid or fresh blood. We now know these are perfectly normal phenomena of decomposition. A body, buried in a cold, damp, and relatively airtight environment can decompose very slowly. A process called saponification can give the skin a waxy, preserved look. And as organs break down, they liquefy into a dark, reddish-brown fluid that could easily be mistaken for blood by terrified, grieving people who are looking for confirmation of their worst fears. Historians who specialize in the history of science and superstition call this confirmation bias. You are not going to the grave to dispassionately investigate a phenomenon. You are going to find a vampire. Therefore, any sign that deviates from your mental image of a dry, clean skeleton will be interpreted as proof. A bit of bloating from gas, proof of unnatural life. A trickle of purge fluid from the mouth, proof that it's been feeding. You are not conducting an experiment. You are performing a ritual, and the outcome is already decided. The academic community still debates the exact origin of this specific heart and blood belief. Was it a direct memory of European vampire lore, or did it emerge independently from misinterpretations of natural decay? The truth is likely a messy combination of both. The folk memory provided the framework, the undead are full of blood, and the gruesome reality of exhumation provided the evidence. Finally, the night arrives. It's cold and starless. The wind whispers through the bare branches of the trees, sounding like voices. You gather with the other men in the barn. No one speaks much. You just pick up the tools, their cold metal is stark, heavy reality in your hands. You check the hooded lantern one last time. Then, moving like shadows, you slip out of the barn and begin the short, silent walk up the hill toward the church and its sleeping, silent yard. A step away from the world of the living and into a dark, forbidden territory. The decision solidifies into grim reality as your small group reaches the low stone wall of the graveyard. The air up on the hill is colder, the wind more insistent. The white steeple of the church is a pale ghost against the black sky, a silent, judging presence. For a moment you all hesitate. This is the final boundary. Crossing this wall means there is no turning back. You are about to commit an act that your community, if they knew, would condemn as barbaric, and that your faith condemns as a sin. But then you think of the coughing that has already started in another of your siblings. You think of the faces of your parents, hollowed out by grief. The fear for the living finally outweighs the reverence for the dead. With a deep breath, you heave yourself over the stone wall, your boots landing with a soft thud on the sacred ground inside. The others follow, their movements furtive and silent. You navigate through the familiar rows of headstones, their carved names undates barely visible in the gloom. You know this place by heart. You know who is buried where. It feels like a profound betrayal to be here under these circumstances, your feet trampling the grass over the graves of your friends and neighbors. You are no longer a mourner, you are an intruder. You reach the family plot. The 3 mounds of earth are there, dark scars on the land. One of your uncles, the most pragmatic of the group, unhoods the lantern, casting a small, trembling circle of light. Which one, he whispers, his voice tight. The debate that happened in the warmth of the kitchen now has to be concluded in the freezing dark. The consensus holds you start with the first one to die. Your sister. It's a strange and poignant detail that in many of these historical cases, the suspected vampire was a young woman. The first person to succumb to consumption in a family was often a daughter or young wife, perhaps because their domestic roles kept them in closer, more constant contact with the initial carrier. This adds another layer of tragedy to the events of father and brothers, driven by a terrible folk logic, standing over the grave of the daughter and sister they once cherished. The first shovel strikes the earth. The sound is shockingly loud in the silence, a dull, wet thump. You all freeze, listening. But there is only the sound of the wind. You get to work, driven by a frantic urgency. The digging is hard, clumsy work in the dark. The soil is dense and full of rocks that clang against your iron shovels. Your breath comes in ragged, white plumes. Your muscles ache, not just from the labor, but from the crushing weight of adrenaline and dread. No one speaks. There is only the rhythmic scrape and thud of the shovels, the grunts of exertion. The hole grows deeper. 6 feet doesn't sound like much, but when you are digging it by hand in the dark, with the goal of retrieving a body, it feels like a journey to the center of the earth. Historians who have studied the legal records of the time note that while these exhumations were technically illegal, falling under laws against grave robbing or desecration of a burial place, prosecutions were extremely rare. This was especially true if the act was carried out by the family of the deceased. There seems to have been a tacit, unspoken understanding within these communities. The authorities, the local sheriffs and settlement, would often look the other way. They understood that this was not an act of malice or theft, but an act of profound, if misguided, desperation. The law, it seemed, was sometimes willing to bend in the face of overwhelming community fear. This question of legality is one academics still explore. Was it official tolerance, or simply that these acts were so secret that they rarely came to the attention of the authorities in the first place? Finally, after what feels like an eternity, one of the shovels makes a different sound. A hollow wooden thud cube hit the coffin. A collective, shuddering breath is released. This is it. The work slows. You carefully scrape the remaining dirt away, revealing the simple pine lid. The lantern is held lower. The small circle of light illuminates the coffin. It's just a box. A plain wooden box you helped build. But now it feels like the door to another world. The man holding the percussive looks at your father, a silent question in his eyes. Your father gives a single grim nod. With a wrenching groan of protesting wooden nails, the lid is pried open. The musty smell of the grave, of damp earth and decay, wafts up. You hold your breath, steeling yourself for what you are about to see. You lean forward, peering into the darkness, into the crucible where your fears will either be confirmed or denied. The moment the coffin lid is pried open is a moment suspended in time. The only sounds are the wind, your own ragged breathing, and the frantic pounding of your heart against your ribs. You and the others lean in, lowering the lantern. The flickering, yellow light spills into the coffin, chasing the shadows away from the face of your deceased sister. What you see is not the clean, peaceful skeleton you might expect from a storybook. Nor is it the snarling, fanged monster of pure fantasy. The reality is something far more ambiguous, and therefore, far more terrifying to your primed imagination. Her face is bloated and discolored, a dark purplish red. Her hair and fingernails, you notice with a jolt of horror, appear to have grown longer. A dark, thick fluid, which looks sickeningly like blood, has trickled from her mouth and stained the simple white shroud she was buried in. Her limbs, when one of your uncles bravely reaches and untouches her arm, are not stiff and rigid. They are supple, almost flexible. And most damningly, when you press on her chest, there is a gassy sigh from her lungs, a sound that mimics a breath. In that moment, all your skepticism, all your residual rational doubt, evaporates. This is not a body at rest. This is not normal. This is proof. Of course, a modern forensic understanding explains every single one of these observations. The bloating is caused by the gases of decomposition building up inside the body cavity. This same pressure can spurge fluid, a mixture of liquefied internal organs and blood, out of the mouth and nose. The appearance of hair and nail growth is an illusion caused by the skin receding and dehydrating. The flexibility of the limbs is a natural stage of decomposition after the initial rigor mortis has passed, and the breath is simply trapped gas being expelled from the lungs when the chest cavity is compressed. But you don't know any of this. You have no concept of forensic taphonomy, the study of how organisms decay. Your only reference points are your own two eyes and the terrifying folklore that has become your operating manual. And what you see confirms the folklore perfectly. The body is fresh. It is plump. It is fed. Here's a particularly strange and morbid detail that appears in some of the historical accounts: the position of the body in the coffin. Sometimes the body would be found with its hands clawed, or the burial shroud torn, as if it had struggled after being buried. The most famous case of this is the Nacht-Zara of German folklore, who was believed to chew on its own shroud in the grave. This was, of course, caused by the natural contortions of the body as muscles and ligaments contracted during decomposition. But to the terrified family peering into the coffin, it looked like undeniable evidence of a conscious, malevolent entity trapped in the grave. The men around you recoil from the coffin, their faces pale in the lantern light. There are muttered prayers, curses. The atmosphere is no longer just one of grim determination. It's now charged with a potent mix of terror and righteous anger. This thing in the box is not your sister anymore. It is a monster. It is the thing that has been murdering your family. The debate about what to do next is brief and frantic. The folklore you've been relying on has specific instructions. You can't just bury it. You have to disable it. You have to destroy the source of its unnatural life. One of the men, perhaps a cousin who remembers the stories from his Irish grandmother, might suggest decapitation. Take the head off, he'd whisper, and place it at the feet. It won't be able to find its way back then. Another, remembering a different strain of the law, might argue for simply flipping the corpse over onto its stomach. The idea was that if the corpse tried to dig its way out, it would only dig itself deeper into the earth. But the most prevalent belief in New England, the one that seems to have taken the firmest hold, is more specific. It focuses on the internal organs. The life force, the unnatural vitality, is not in the brain or the limbs. It's in the heart and the liver, which are believed to be gored with the stolen life of the living. There's a great deal of academic debate about why the heart became the central focus of this ritual. Was it simply a continuation of ancient beliefs that saw the heart as the seat of life and emotion, or was there a more practical reason the heart is one of the last organs to fully decompose, especially the tough, muscular ventricles? When a grieving, terrified farmer cut into the chest of a relatively recently deceased relative, the heart would be one of the most recognizable and intact organs, and it would be filled with the dark, liquefied blood of decomposition. It looked exactly like the legends said it would. Your father makes the final decision. The heart, he says, his voice a low growl. We have to take the heart. He points to the sharpest knife they brought, a long, sturdy blade normally used for butchering hogs. The man holding it looks down at the knife, then at the body in the coffin, his hand trembling. The most gruesome part of the night's work is about to begin. The lantern is placed precariously on the edge of the grave, its light casting long, distorted shadows that make the whole scene feel even more unreal. The man with the butchering knife takes a deep, shuddering breath, muttering a prayer or a curse under his breath. He kneels beside the open coffin. This is the ultimate transgression. It's one thing to dig up the dead, another thing entirely to mutilate the body of someone you once loved. But in his mind, and in yours, this is no longer a person. It is an object, a vessel of pestilence that must be neutralized. With a grim determination, he leans into the coffin and cuts through the burial shroud and the simple dress beneath, the fabric parts revealing the discolored skin of the chest. Then, He begins the horrific task of cutting into the body itself. It's a clumsy, gruesome business, not the clean, precise work of a surgeon. The knife makes a wet, tearing sound as it cuts through the skin and muscle. The smell, already thick with damp earth and decay, now intensifies with a new coppery and deeply unpleasant odor. You and the others stand back, watching in horrified silence. Part of you wants to scream to stop this desecration. This is your sister, your daughter. But the other part of you, the part that has seen 3 family members die, is screaming louder. This is what it takes. This is the only way. Finally, after what feels like an eternity of grunting and sawing, the man pulls his hands back. He is holding a dark, heavy organ in his hands. It's the heart. In the flickering lantern light, it looks black and swollen. When he holds it up, the dark, liquefied blood that was pooled within it drips from the severed arteries onto the cuff and in the ground below. To your terrified eyes, this is the final, irrefutable proof. It is a heart gored with the blood of your family. It is the very engine of the curse. The organ is quickly wrapped in a piece of cloth. The work is not yet done. Some versions of the ritual required that the liver be examined or burned as well. In other, even more extreme cases documented in folkloric records, the men would remove all the vital organs, heart, liver, lungs to be certain. The level of mutilation often uncorrelated with the level of the family's desperation. One of the strangest and most debated aspects of these rituals is the role of fire. Why burning fire has always held a dual symbolism for humanity. It is a source of warmth and light, a center of the home. But it is also a powerful agent of purification and destruction. In almost every culture, fire is seen as a way to cleanse corruption, to destroy evil, to return something to its elemental state. By burning the heart, you are not just destroying an organ, you are performing a powerful magical act. You are transmuting the tainted, corrupt flesh into sterile ash, neutralizing its malevolent power. But where do you build this fire? You can't do it here in the graveyard. The light would be seen for miles, and it would be the ultimate act of public sacrilege. The fire must be built somewhere secret, somewhere safe. The most logical place is back at your own home, using the very hearth that is supposed to be the heart of the family. The men work quickly now, a sense of grim purpose having replaced their earlier hesitation. The desecrated body is left in the coffin. There is no ceremony, no prayer of apology. The lid is placed back on, though not always nailed shut. Then you begin the frantic work of filling the grave back in. Shovel of dirt is thrown back into the hole, covering the evidence of your terrible night's work. You try to make the mound of earth look as undisturbed as possible, perhaps scattering some fallen leaves over it to hide the fresh dirt. Finally, it is done. The grave looks more or less as it did before, at least in the dark. The small group gathers their tools, their hands and clothes stained with dirt and worse. One man holds the bundled hulk. The lantern is hooded again. You scramble back over the stone wall, leaving the silent graveyard behind. The walk back to the farmhouse is very different from the walk up. The trip up was filled with dread and apprehension. The trip back is suffused with a strange manic energy. You have faced the monster, you have confronted the source of your family's suffering, and you have ripped out its heart. You have done the unthinkable, and in doing so you feel a surge of power, of control. For the first time in months, you are not a passive victim waiting to die. You are a fighter. You have a weapon. The most crucial part of the ritual is about to begin, the part you hope will finally bring the healing. You slip back into the farmhouse, the men carrying the tools and the grim, cloth-wrapped bundle. The women of the family are waiting, their faces pale and anxious in the dim light of a single candle. They don't ask what you saw. They can see it in your eyes, in the grim set of your jaws. They know the worst fears have been confirmed. All eyes turn to the hearth. The fireplace, the center of domestic life, is about to be transformed into a ritual altar. A fire is carefully built, not a large, roaring blaze, but a small, hot fire of seasoned hardwood, the kind that produces glowing embers perfect for this task. The air in the small room grows thick with anticipation. The cloth is unwrapped, and the heart is placed on a stone or metal plate directly in the embers. The ritual has begun. The organ begins to cook. It sizzles and sputters. A thick, acrid smoke fills the room, a smell so foul it makes your eyes water and your stomach turn. It doesn't smell like meat cooking on a fire, it smells like corruption being burned away. This powerful, sensory experience is a key part of the ritual's psychological power. You are not just seeing the evil destroyed, you are smelling it, breathing it in. It makes the abstract concept of purification feel viscerally real. You and your family stand and watch, mesmerized by the ghastly process. You watch as the organ blackens, chars, and slowly crumbles into ash. This process can take a long time, and you wait with a patient, solemn intensity. Every sizzle, every wisp of smoke, is a sign that the curse is being broken, that the malevolent connection between the dead and the living is being severed. Now, we come to the part of the ritual that is, for many, the most disturbing and medically baffling part of the entire phenomenon: what to do with the ashes. In some accounts, simply burning the heart was considered sufficient. The smoke was believed to carry the sickness away, or the act of destruction itself was the cure. But in many of the most well-documented cases, the ritual had a second, crucial step. The ashes of the burned heart were carefully collected, ground into a fine powder, and then mixed with water or medicine to create a potion. And this potion was then given to the sick, living family member to drink. Let that sink in for a moment. The cure for the suspected victim of a vampire was to consume the ashes of that vampire's heart. From a modern perspective, this is incomprehensible. It's a biohazard nightmare, forcing an already desperately ill person to ingest the cremated remains of a diseased organ. But the folk logic behind it, while twisted, had its own internal consistency. Historians and folklorists are still in deep debate over the meaning of this act. There are several competing theories. One theory, based on principles of sympathetic magic, is that like cures like. By consuming a small part of the aggressor, the victim absorbs its power and becomes immune to it. It's a bit like a primitive, magical form of inoculation. Another theory is that it was an act of final domination. By consuming the very essence of the vampire, the living family member asserts their ultimate victory over it. A third, more psychological interpretation suggests that it was a way of symbolically reincorporating the dead family member back into the family, but in a tamed or purified form, thus resolving the grief and trauma. Whatever the reason, this was the final, desperate hope. You watch as your mother or father carefully scrapes the grey, gritty ashes from the hearth. They are mixed into a cup of water, a grim, unholy communion. It is then carried to the bedside of the currently ailing family member, your other sister perhaps, who is in the grip of the same wasting sickness. She is propped up on her pillows, weak and feverish. She is told what this is. She is told that this is the cure, the only hope. And, weak as she is, she drinks it. She swallows the gritty mixture of ash and water, placing her faith not in a doctor's science, but in the dark, ancient magic her family has just performed. Now, all you can do is wait. The men are exhausted from the physical and emotional ordeal of the night. The family is united in a shared secret, a shared transgression, and a shared fragile hope. You have fought back against the darkness with the dark magic of your own. You look at the sick family member praying, hoping to see a sign, any sign that it has worked, that the wasting will stop, that the color will return to her cheeks, that the long night of your family's suffering is finally over. In the days immediately following the ritual, a strange and fragile sense of peace settles over your household. It's not joy, not yet, but a quiet, exhausted relief. The terrible act is done. You have confronted your demon, and you have performed the prescribed cure. For the first time in months, you feel a flicker of hope. You watch the sick family member with an obsessive focus. Every cough, every sigh, every moment of sleep is scrutinized for meaning. And, for a little while, it seems to be working. Perhaps the patient has a good day. Her fever might break for a few hours. She might have enough energy to sit up in bed and eat a little broth. You and your family seize on these tiny improvements as proof. Did you see she has more color in her cheeks today? Her cough doesn't sound as deep. Confirmation bias is a powerful force, especially when you are desperate to believe. This temporary improvement is, tragically, a well-known feature of tuberculosis. The disease is not a straight downward line. It has periods of remission where the patient seems to rally before relapsing again. To a family who has just performed a powerful and traumatic ritual, this natural ebb and flow of the illness looks like a direct result of their actions. The magic is working. A small, cautious sense of normalcy begins to return. The men go back to the fields, their shoulders a little less slumped. The women's conversations in the kitchen are a little lighter. You might even find yourself smiling for the first time in a long time. You have a secret, of course, a dark and terrible one, but it is a secret of your success. You have outsmarted death. You have protected your family where science and faith had failed. This brief period of hope is a crucial part of the cycle. It reinforces the belief in the ritual's efficacy. When news of your family's apparent cure gets out, and it will, through hushed whispers and knowing glances in town, it will strengthen the folklore. Another family, facing the same desperate situation a few towns over, will hear the story of how you saved your kin. They won't hear about the gruesome details of the exhumation, but they will hear the essential part: you identified the source. You performed the ritual, and the dying stopped. Your story becomes another data point, another piece of evidence that this dark magic works. But then a week or two later, the hope begins to fray. The sick family member has a bad night. The fever returns higher than before. The cough comes back with a new, rattling violence. The brief remission is over. The disease, which was never gone, reasserts its grip. The dawning horror is almost worse than the initial despair. You did the unthinkable. You violated every sacred taboo. You placed all your hope in this one terrible act. And it failed. The vampire is not defeated. Or, even worse, a new and terrifying thought begins to creep in: what if you got the wrong one? This was a common and tragic outcome. The family had performed the ritual on the first person who died, but the sickness continued. Their folk logic demanded an explanation. The only possible conclusion was that the first victim wasn't the vampire, or wasn't the only one. The true source must be another of the recently deceased. And so, in some of the most extreme cases, the family would go back to the graveyard. They would dig up the second body. One of the more peculiar historical accounts involves a family that, having exhumed and burned the heart of one relative to no effect, concluded that the vampiric tendency was in the bloodline itself. Their solution was to have the entire surviving family stand in the smoke of the burning heart, believing that the cleansing smoke would protect them from their own inherited curse. This shows the incredible flexibility of folk belief, how it could twist and adapt to accommodate failure. The academic community still debates the psychological impact of the ritual's failure. Did it shatter the family's belief in folk magic, or did it simply push them to more and more extreme versions of it? The evidence suggests the latter. When you are at the absolute bottom, and you've already committed a great transgression, it's often easier to double down than to admit it was all for nothing. To accept that you desecrated a loved one's grave for no reason is a psychological burden almost too heavy to bear. It is easier to believe you simply made a mistake in the procedure. The mood in your house plummets into a new, deeper level of despair. The brief hope has made the return of the sickness even more cruel. The patient fades quickly now. The family watches, their faces masks of stunned disbelief. The magic failed. There is nothing left to do now but wait for the inevitable. And as the fourth death in your family arrives, you are left with not only the crushing weight of grief, but also the sickening, secret guilt of what you did in the dark. The graves you disturbed, the body you mutilated, it was all for nothing. The monster, whatever it is still feeding, and you are out of options. The failure of the ritual plunges your family into a state of profound, shattered silence. You are no longer just victims of a terrible disease, you are fools who have been tricked by dark old stories. Every time you walk past the graveyard, you can't help but think of the desecrated coffin resting beneath the soil. You are haunted not by a vampire, but by the memory of your own desperate, terrible actions. But your personal tragedy, your secret shame, is about to become part of a much larger phenomenon. Your family's story, stripped of its failure and distilled into a potent rumor, begins to travel. It moves at the speed of a horse-drawn wagon, carried from one small town to the next. It spread through the informal networks that connected these isolated communities, traveling peddlers, itinerant preachers, relatives visiting from another county. In the general store of a town 20 miles away, a farmer might hear it. Heard about a family up in the hills, the storekeeper might say, leaning over the counter. Lost 3, maybe 4, to consumption. The 5th one was on her deathbed. They did what was necessary. Dug up the first one. Burned the heart. And the girl recovered. The story has already changed in the telling. The failure is edited out. The temporary mission is transformed into a miraculous cure. This is how a local, isolated panic becomes a regional epidemic of fear. The newspapers of the day play a fascinating and complex role in this process. Local papers in the 19th century were a wild mix of serious news, political commentary, farming advice, and sensationalist stories. They loved a good, strange tale. A story about a family digging up a suspected vampire was prime content. It was shocking, gothic, and spoke to the deepest fears of their readership. So a small article might appear in a local weekly. It might be written with a tone of sophisticated, urban disbelief, presenting the story as an example of ignorant country superstition. The editor might write a scathing piece about the lack of education and the persistence of barbaric medieval beliefs in modern America. But the effect of such an article was often the exact opposite of what was intended. For the educated reader in the city, it was a source of smug amusement. But for a desperate family in a rural area, reading that same article, the message was different. They wouldn't focus on the editor's condescending tone. They would focus on the details of the story, a family suffering from consumption, a belief that the dead were responsible, and a ritualistic cure. The article, intended as a condemnation, accidentally served as a how-to guide. It legitimized their fears by showing that other people just like them, were thinking and doing the same things. It told them they were not alone in their terror. A weird little quirk of this era was the newspaper exchange system. Small town papers would freely reprint articles from each other. So a story that first appeared in a small Vermont newspaper could be reprinted a week later in a paper in Rhode Island, and then a month later in Connecticut. A single exhumation could, through the power of the press, inspire a dozen more across New England. The panic piggybacked on the era's growing media network. Historians who study mass hysteria have identified this as a key mechanism. A panic needs a narrative, and it needs a vector of transmission. The narrative was the vampire folklore. The vectors were word of mouth and, ironically, the very newspapers that claimed to be fighting against superstition. The debate about the media's role is ongoing. Were these newspaper editors consciously sensationalizing these stories to sell papers, or did they genuinely believe they were performing a public service by exposing ignorance? The answer is likely a mix of both. But the result was undeniable. The idea of the New England vampire became a known phenomenon, a shared cultural script. As you sit in your own quiet, grieving house, you are unaware of all this. You are only aware of your own failure, but your story is no longer your own. It has escaped, mutated, and is now taking root in the minds of other families who are at the very beginning of the same tragic journey you have just completed. They are hearing the stories, they are reading the papers, and they are looking at the graves of their own recently deceased loved ones with a dawning, terrible suspicion. The personal horror you endured has become a public contagion. The panic is spreading. As the panic spreads, it starts to take on a life of its own, mutating and adapting to the specific fears and folk traditions of each small, isolated community. You might think that a single, clear-cut vampire-slaying protocol would emerge, but that's not how it works. It's more like a game of telephone, where the core message remains, but the details change with each retelling. The result is a bizarre and fascinating variety of rituals across the region, each one a unique local flavor of the same core desperation. In your town, the ritual was to burn the heart and feed the ashes to the sick. But in a neighboring valley in Vermont, you might hear of a different method. There, the prevailing belief might be that the problem isn't that the dead is feeding, but that it's simply restless. It carved for agitation is what's making the living sick. So, after exhuming the body and confirming it's unusually fresh, the family wouldn't burn the heart. Instead, they would perform a second, grim killing, They might decapitate the corpse and place the skull between its legs. The logic was that a headless body couldn't find its way out of the grave to trouble the living. In another town, perhaps one with a strong German immigrant population, the focus might be on the mouth. Drawing from the Natchez legends, they believed the creature consumed its family's life force by chewing on its own burial shroud. The solution: pry open the corpse's jaw to place a large rock or a brick inside it to prevent it from eating. There are archaeological discoveries from this period and region of skeletons buried with precisely such objects in their mouths, a chilling testament to these practices. Then there was the simple, almost pragmatic, approach of just turning the body over. In several documented cases, the family dug up the suspect, saw the signs of unnatural preservation, and simply flipped the corpse face down in the coffin before reburying it. The belief was beautifully simple: if the restless spirit tried to claw its way out, it would only dig itself deeper into the earth, away from the world of the living. It's a solution that is both utterly bizarre and strangely logical within its own superstitious framework. One of the more obscure, and frankly creepy, variations involve the use of specific plants. In some older European traditions, it was believed that scattering the seeds of a poppy or wild rose on the grave would protect the living. The restless spirit would be compelled to stop and count every single seed before it could rise, a task so long it would be overtaken by the dawn. While less common in New England, traces of this belief in Apot Ropa ICS items that ward off evil persisted. A family might not go so far as to dig up the body, but they might plant a specific type of thorny bush on the grave, believing its thorns would form a spiritual barrier to contain the dead. The academic world still puzzles over this ritualistic diversity. Why did one town burn the heart while another was content to just flip the body over? The answer likely lies in the specific cultural baggage of each community. A town settled primarily by English immigrants might follow one tradition, while a town with a mix of Scots, Irish and German families would create a hybrid ritual. The local minister's influence also played a role. A minister who strongly condemned these practices might force his congregation to adopt more subtle, less destructive rituals, like planting a bush rather than a full-blown exhumation and mutilation. This variation highlights a crucial point. This was not an organized vampire cult. There was no central book of rules. This was a grassroots, folk phenomenon cobbled together from half-remembered stories, local interpretations, and desperate improvisations. It was a fluid, living belief system, constantly being reshaped by the communities that practiced it. So, while you are trapped in your own town, convinced that your method was the correct one even if it failed, you would be amazed to discover the sheer variety of solutions being attempted just over the next hill. Each little town, each isolated valley, had its own unique way of fighting the same monster. It's a poignant testament to human ingenuity in the face of terror, a landscape not of one single panic, but of 100 small, distinct panics, each with its own strange and tragic rituals. The monster had many names, and its hunters had many methods, but the fear that drove them all was universal. While these dark rituals are being carried out in the secrecy of moonless nights and the privacy of terrified homes, another world exists just a few dozen miles away. This is the world of the cities Boston, Providence, Hartford. Here the air smells of coal smoke and sea salt, not damp earth and wood smoke. The pace of life is faster, the community is larger and more anonymous, and the dominant worldview is shifting, slowly but surely, towards something we would recognize as modern. A few faint voices of reason begin to speak out against the panic gripping the countryside. Imagine a doctor in Boston, H.E.S. a man of science, or at least the 19th century version of it. H.E.S. read the latest medical journals from Europe. He might not know about bacteria yet, but he understands concepts like contagion and public sanitation. He's a proponent of clean water, fresh air, and a varied diet. When he reads a sensationalist account in the newspaper about a vampire being exhumed in some rural backwater, he doesn't see a supernatural mystery. He sees a public health crisis compounded by tragic ignorance. He might write a letter to the editor of that same newspaper. In formal, slightly condescending prose, he would patiently explain the nature of pulmonary consumption. He would describe how the disease wastes the body, how it can be transmitted between family members living in close, and the tilted quarters. He would explain the natural processes of decomposition, debunking the signs of vampirism one by one. The bloating, the fresh blood which he would correctly identify as purge fluid, the apparent growth of hair and nails, he would explain it all as the sad, predictable course of nature. He would end his letter with a plea for education and a condemnation of the relics of a barbarous age that are leading good Christian people to desecrate the graves of their own kin. Another voice of opposition might come from an educated, forward-thinking minister in a prosperous town. Unlike the rural preacher who might be caught up in the local hysteria or simply turn a blind eye, this urban clergyman sees the panic as a theological threat. He would stand at his pulpit and deliver a fiery sermon against superstition. He would argue that these rituals are not just ignorant, but pagan. They demonstrate a lack of faith in God's providence and a blasphemous return to the dark magic that Christianity had fought to extinguish. He would remind his flock that the body is sacred, a temple of the Holy Spirit, and that to mutilate it after death is an offense against God and a denial of the promise of resurrection. His words would be reprinted in religious pamphlets and distributed, a theological counter-offensive against the folk belief. And here's a quirky little detail about the pushback: it also came from the folk themselves, just a different kind. There were other sets of superstitions that sometimes ran counter to the vampire panic. For example, a deeply held belief from many was that a disturbed grave would bring bad luck, not just to the family, but to the entire town. A restless spirit, once provoked, might haunt the whole community. You could have a situation where one family's attempt to cure their sickness would be met with outrage from their neighbors, who feared it would unleash a wider, more unpredictable evil. It was a battle of superstition versus superstition. The problem was that these voices of reason were, for the most part, preaching to the choir. The people reading the Boston doctor's letter were other educated city dwellers, who already agreed with him. The congregation listening to the urban minister's sermon were not the ones with shovels in their hands. The rational arguments rarely penetrated the isolated, fear-soaked communities where the panic was most intense. The cultural and intellectual gap between the city and the countryside was immense. To you, in your small town, the words of a Boston doctor would seem arrogant and out of touch. What does he know of your suffering? Has he watched his family die? One by one his neat, scientific explanations feel cold and insulting in the face of your overwhelming grief and terror. The academic debate on this topic continues. Just how effective was this rationalist critique for a long time? The prevailing historical view was that science and enlightenment simply triumphed over superstition. But more recent scholarship suggests it was a much messier, more complicated process. The rational voices were not a unified chorus, and their message was often garbled or ignored. The panic didn't just vanish because a doctor wrote a letter. It faded for a host of other, more complex reasons. For now, though, these rational voices are just a faint, distant hum. In your world, the world of the panic, they are drowned out by the sound of coughing and the frantic whispers planning the next exhumation. As you stand in the desolate quiet of your home, having performed a forbidden ritual with no success, a new fear might creep into your mind. What if someone finds out? What if the sheriff comes knocking? This brings up a fascinating and murky question. What did the law actually have to say about all of this? Was digging up your own relatives to burn their hearts a crime? The answer is complicated. In the 19th century, the American legal system was a patchwork of state laws and English common law traditions. There wasn't a specific federal law against vampire hunting. Instead, such an act would fall under a few different legal concepts. The most obvious one was grave robbing or body snatching. This was a serious crime, but it was primarily aimed at stopping the illicit trade in cadavers for medical schools. Doctors and students were so desperate for bodies to dissect that they would pay shadowy figures to dig up fresh corpses. The laws were written to punish people who stole bodies for profit or anatomical study. A family digging up its own kin for ritualistic purposes didn't quite fit the profile. Then there was the charge of desecrating a burial ground. This was more of a public order offense. A graveyard was considered consecrated, sacred ground. To disturb it was an offense against the community and the church. A family could theoretically be prosecuted for this, but here's where the community's own beliefs came into play. A local sheriff or justice of the peace was a member of that same community. He knew the families involved. He had likely attended the funerals of the very people being exhumed. He understood the terror of consumption. While he might personally find the practice abhorrent, he would also be deeply reluctant to punish a family that was already suffering so immensely. Prosecuting a grieving father for trying to save his last living child would have been seen as cruel and pointless. This is where you see a huge gap between the law on the books and the law in practice. On paper, yes, it was illegal, but in reality, as long as the act was done secretly, by the family themselves, and didn't cause a major public disturbance, the authorities often chose to look the other way. It was a form of unofficial, compassionate neglect. However, things could get complicated if there was a dispute. Imagine a scenario where a young wife dies of consumption, and her family becomes convinced she's the vampire draining her husband's family. They might demand an exhumation. But what if her own family, her father and brothers, were horrified by the idea and forbade it? Now you have a conflict. If the husband's family went ahead anyway, the wife's family could press charges. In these rare cases, the law would have to get involved, and the results were unpredictable. One of the more peculiar legal grey areas involved the folk experts who were sometimes called in. If a family paid a traveling quack doctor to oversee the ritual, that person could potentially be charged with fraud or practicing medicine without a license. The family was seen as victims of a charlatan rather than perpetrators of a crime. This was a way for the legal system to punish someone without having to punish the grieving family. The academic debate about the legal history of the panic is fascinating. Some scholars argue that the lack of prosecution shows a widespread, tacit acceptance of the folk beliefs, even among local officials. They argue it proves that the age of reason had not fully penetrated these rural areas. Other historians take a different view. They suggest the lack of cases is simply evidence of how secret these rituals were, and that if more had come to light, more prosecutions would have occurred. They point to the fact that when these cases did make it to court, the defendants were often portrayed as ignorant and foolish, and the practice was condemned. So, as you worry in your home, the truth is you are probably safe from the law, as long as you all keep your secret. The greatest danger is not the sheriff, it's the judgment of your neighbors if the story gets out and your ritual is seen as a failure. You would be doubly condemned, first for your superstitious barbarism, and second for your incompetence. The shame and ostracism would be far worse than any fine or jail sentence a local magistrate might impose. You are trapped, not by legal chains, but by the chains of community opinion and your own guilty conscience. The law, for the most part, remains a distant, uninterested observer in your personal, supernatural drama. The battle against the vampire wasn't just fought in graveyards with shovels, it was also fought on the pages of the local newspapers. As stories of the panic spread, they ignited a fierce and public debate, creating a fascinating snapshot of the 19th century American mind at war with itself. Reading these old, yellowed newspapers is like eavesdropping on the era's anxieties. You might pick up a copy of the Connecticut Courant or the Vermont Phoenix, and on the front page, you'd see news about politics, shipping schedules, and crop prices, the business of a rational, progressing nation. But tucked away in the inside pages, you'd find the articles that truly captured the public's imagination. The debate usually started with a report, often written with a tone of detached, slightly horrified fascination. An anonymous correspondent from a small town in the Green Mountains would relate the story of a family ravished by consumption, who resorted to an old and singular custom. The article would describe the exhumation and the burning of the heart, often using phrases like a scene we forbear to describe to hint at the horror without being too graphic. This initial report would act like a stone to a pond. In the following weeks, the ripples would spread in the form of letters to the editor. This was the 19th century version of a comment section, and it was just as passionate. The letters would come from all sides. First, you'd have the Voice of Progress. This would be a letter signed by a man of science or medicus. It would be the Boston Doctor's Argument, written for a wider audience. He would scold the rural communities for their deplorable ignorance and pitiable superstition. He'd talk about the great advancements of the age, the power of reason, and how such pagan rituals were a stain on the character of the nation. These letters were often arrogant, condescending, and deeply insulting to the people they were trying to persuade. Then you'd get a letter from a clergyman or veritas. This would be the theological argument. The writer would condemn the practice as unchristian, a denial of the resurrection and a descent into the kind of witchcraft their Puritan forefathers had fought so hard to eradicate. They would quote scripture and warn of the damnation that awaited those who disturbed the sacred rest of the dead. But then you'd get the most interesting letters of all. They would be signed with humble pseudonyms like a farmer or one who was seen. These were the defenders. They wouldn't try to argue science or theology. They would argue from personal experience. Your correspondent medicus may sit in his comfortable Boston office and write of his theories. A letter might begin, "But has he ever buried 3 of his own children in a single year? Has he watched his wife waste away before his eyes when the doctors have shaken their heads and walked away?" These letters were raw, emotional, and powerful. They would argue that the ritual, strange as it seemed, worked. They would offer anecdotal evidence. "I know of a family who performed this rite, and the sickness stopped that very day." They weren't arguing for the existence of vampires in a literal, Dracula sense. They were arguing for the existence of something inexplicable that was killing their families, and for the validity of a cure that, from their perspective, was their only hope. It was a desperate plea to be understood, not judged. One of the more quirky and revealing aspects of this debate was the use of history. Both sides would try to use history to support their claims. The rationalists would say these practices were disgusting relics of the Dark Ages, something America had supposedly left behind. The defenders, on the other hand, would argue that this was ancient wisdom, a knowledge passed down from their forefathers who understood the world in a way modern man had forgotten. The exact same historical fact that the belief was old was used as both a condemnation and a validation. Historians are still analyzing this public discourse. Was it a straightforward battle of science versus superstition, or was it more of a class-based conflict, with the urban elite trying to impose their worldview on a rural population that felt ignored and patronized? It was also, in a way, a debate about American identity. Was America a nation of enlightened progress, or was it still a place of deep, primordial fears and folk traditions? The answer, as revealed in these newspaper pages, was that it was both at the same time. As you sit in your house, you are the silent subject of this loud, public debate. The man of science is talking about you. The clergyman is talking about you. They are all using your family's tragedy as ammunition in a larger cultural war, reducing your profound personal horror to a talking point. And none of them, you feel, truly understands. While you and your community are trapped in a cycle of fear and folk ritual, and the newspapers are buzzing with debate, a quiet revolution is happening in laboratories across Europe. This revolution is invisible to you. It's happening in a world of glass sides, brass microscopes, and strange chemical dyes. It has no immediate impact on your life, but it is about to render the entire vampire panic obsolete. It is the moment when humanity finally gets a good look at the real monster. Let's fast forward our clock just a little bit to the year 1882. The place is Berlin, Germany. A meticulous, serious-minded doctor named Robert Koch is about to present his findings to the Berlin Physiological Society. For months, he has been working obsessively, trying to isolate the cause of tuberculosis, the very disease they call consumption. He has been collecting samples of sputum from patients, staining them with different dyes, and peering at them for hours under the most powerful microscope of his day. Previous scientists had seen bacteria, but Koch was the first to develop a systematic method for proving that a specific disease. These are called Koch's postulates, and they are still a fundamental principle of microbiology today. He had to grow the bacterium in a pure culture, inject it into a healthy animal, see if the animal got the same disease, and then isolate the exact same bacterium from the newly sick animal. It was brilliant, methodical, and definitive. Now imagine yourself in that lecture hall in Berlin. The room is filled with bearded, serious-looking scientists. Koch stands at the podium and calmly announces that he has found the culprit. He calls it Mycobacterium tuberculosis. He projects magnified images of it for all to see, tiny, rod-shaped bacilli. This is it. This is the killer. Not a restless spirit. Not a supernatural curse, but a microscopic organism. This is the real monster. It's not a dramatic, fanged creature of the night. It's a simple celled life form, invisible to the naked eye, whose only purpose is to replicate. It's a killer without malice, an engine of destruction without consciousness. The sheer banal reality of it is almost more terrifying than the gothic fantasy of the vampire. The vampire, at least, is a foe you can confront with passion and ritual. How do you fight an enemy you can't even see? The news of Koch's discovery spread through the scientific community like wildfire. It was a monumental breakthrough, one of the single greatest achievements in the history of medicine. It opened the door to the germ theory of disease, revolutionizing public health and sanitation. But scientific breakthroughs don't change the world overnight. The news traveled slowly from the lecture halls of Berlin to the general practitioners in Boston, and even more slowly to the royal doctors making their rounds on horseback in New England. A fascinating and frustrating detail of medical history is the lag time between a discovery and its widespread acceptance and implementation. For years after Koch's discovery, many doctors continued to believe in the old theories of miasma S, or hereditary weakness. They were resistant to change, skeptical of these newfangled German ideas. And if the doctors were slow to adapt, you can imagine how long it took for this information to trickle down to you, the farmer in a small, isolated town. You might hear a rumor about it at the general store, some talk of tiny animals in the air causing sickness. It would sound fantastical, unbelievable, Rods. It sounds far more ridiculous than the idea that your dead aunt is draining your family's life force. The vampire theory, for all its horror, is at least tangible. A villain you can picture and a ritual you can perform. The germ theory is abstract, invisible, and at first offers no clear cure. The academic world still studies this transition period, debating how and why the scientific explanation eventually won out over the folk belief. It wasn't just the power of the evidence itself. It was a combination of factors: rising levels of education, better communication, and, crucially, the eventual development of effective treatments based on the new science. The folk belief didn't just disappear, it was slowly crowded out by a new explanation that, over time, proved to be more effective at actually saving lives. But for now, in the last years of the 19th century, these two worlds exist in parallel. In one world, the world of science, the enemy has been identified. In your world, the world of fear, you are still looking for answers in the grave. The light of the microscope has illuminated the truth, but its beam has not yet reached the dark, shadowed corners of New England where you are still fighting monsters of a very different kind. The discovery of the tubercle bacillus didn't just provide a new explanation for consumption, it demanded a new kind of response. If the disease was caused by an invisible germ that thrived in close, damp, and poorly ventilated spaces, then the old cures, whether it was the doctor's bleeding bowl or the folk ritual of burning a heart, were not only useless but dangerously misguided. The fight against tuberculosis had to move out of the graveyard and into the living room, and eventually out of the home altogether. This led to the rise of one of the most iconic institutions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the sanatorium. The concept was pioneered in Europe and quickly spread to America. The core idea was based on the new understanding of the disease. Since there was no magic bullet drug to kill the bacteria yet, the best hope was to strengthen the patient's own body so it could fight off the infection. And the prescription for this was simple: rest, nutrition, and, above all, fresh air. Imagine the contrast. Your home is small, dull, and crowded. The windows are kept shut for warmth. The air is thick with wood smoke and the germs of the sick. The new sanatoriums were the complete opposite. They were often built in beautiful, remote mountains or by the sea, places known for their clean, pure air. They were buildings designed around the cure. They featured huge windows that were always kept open, even in winter. The most prominent feature was the cure porch, a long, covered veranda where patients would spend the entire day, and sometimes even the night, resting on beds or lounge chairs bundled up in blankets. The daily routine in a sanatorium was rigidly structured. You'd be woken early, have a large, nutritious breakfast, and then be wheeled out to the cure porch for hours of heliotherapy, sun exposure, and fresh air. Talking was often discouraged to conserve energy. The main activities were reading, writing letters, and simply resting, breathing in the cold, clean air. It was a life of enforced idleness, a complete departure from the back-breaking labor of farm life. For someone from your background, being sent to a sanatorium would be a culture shock. It was an admission of a new kind of defeat. Instead of being cared for by your family at home, you were being sent away, isolated from your loved ones to protect them from your germs. While medically necessary, it created a new kind of emotional pain and loneliness. A strange and poignant subculture developed within these sanatoriums. They were communities of the sick, places suspended between life and death. Friendships and romances blossomed, all shadowed by the constant presence of the disease. Patients would watch as their neighbors on the cure porch either graduated, were deemed well enough to leave, or were quietly wheeled away in the middle of the night. It was a world of its own, with its own gallows humor and its own quiet desperation. The sanatorium movement represents a major turning point in the cultural response to disease. It medicalized consumption. The patient was no longer seen as a victim of a family curse or a supernatural attack. They were a medical case to be managed by professionals in a specialized institution. This shift was crucial in dismantling the vampire panic. Why would you dig up your dead? And if the doctor could now give you a clear, scientific reason for the sickness and, more importantly, a concrete plan of action, the sanatorium offered a new kind of hope, one based on science, not superstition. It gave families something to do that felt productive and rational. Instead of sharpening a shovel, you would save your money to pay for your child's stay at the state sanatorium. Historians debate the true medical efficacy of the early sanatoriums. Before the advent of antibiotics, the cure rates were not fantastic. Many patients still died. But their psychological and social impact was enormous. They replaced a terrifying, Gothic narrative with a sterile medical one. They took the fight out of the dark, secret world of folklore and put it into the bright, eerie, and regulated world of institutional medicine. The rise of the sanatorium and the decline of the vampire panic were two sides of the same coin. The sanatorium was a physical manifestation of the new germ theory. It was a building that declared, the enemy is in the air, not in the grave. It would take decades for this new approach to fully take hold, but the foundation was laid. The era of the vampire was ending, not with a climactic battle, but with the quiet, methodical construction of cure porches and the sound of patients breathing in the cold. Mountaineer, decades pass. The world changes. The 19th century, with its flickering candlelight and horse-drawn wagons, gives way to the 20th. Electric lights begin to appear in towns. The first sputtering automobiles kick up dust on the roads where you once feared to walk at night. The children who survived the era of the panic are now old men and women, with grandchildren of their own who have never known the terror of consumption. And a profound silence descends upon the topic of the vampires. If you were to return to your small New England town in, say, 1930, and ask one of the old-timers about the time they dug up their neighbors, you would be met with a stony silence, a quick change of subject, or a flat-out denial. Never heard of such a thing, they might say, their eyes refusing to meet yours. Just foolish old stories. This phenomenon is what historians call cultural amnesia. The events were so traumatic, and in retrospect, so deeply embarrassing that the communities that participated in them collectively chose to forget. The exhumatations and heartburnings were not woven into the proud tapestry of the town's history. They weren't mentioned at the town's centennial celebration. They were a shameful secret, a skeleton in the community's closet, to be buried even deeper than the bodies they had once disturbed. The shame was multi-layered. There was the shame of ignorance, of having believed in old country nonsense in a nation that prided itself on progress and enlightenment. There was the personal shame for the families involved, the memory of having mutilated a loved one's body. And there was the religious shame, the sin of having abandoned faith in favor of a pagan ritual. It was easier to pretend it never happened. This silence was incredibly effective. For much of the 20th century, the New England vampire panic was largely forgotten by popular history. It was a footnote in obscure academic journals, a piece of local folklore known only to a few dedicated regional historians. It didn't fit the neat, triumphant narrative of American history. The story of the Puritans, the Revolution, the Resolution, the westward expansion that was the story America wanted to tell itself. A story about panicked farmers performing medieval rituals on their own dead relatives that didn't make the cut. A fascinating detail is how the oral tradition itself died. The old woman who once told stories of the Natchez era by the fire would not pass those specific tales on to her grandchildren. Or if she did, she would frame them as silly stories my grandmother used to tell, stripping them of their power and their terrible practicality. The knowledge of how to perform the ritual once considered vital was now seen as toxic, dangerous information to be suppressed. The academic world continues to debate the nature of this forgetting. Was it a conscious, deliberate process, or a more organic fading away as the generation with first-hand experience died off? It was likely both. Individuals made the choice not to speak of it, and as they passed away, the communal memory faded. The landscape itself helped with the forgetting. The family farms were sold off, the old houses tore down. The small isolated communities became less isolated. The world that had created the panic simply ceased to exist. But secrets have a way of leaving traces. The evidence remained buried in the ground. In the late 20th century, archaeologists excavating old burial grounds would occasionally find things that didn't make sense. A skeleton with its head removed and placed by its knees. A femur bone broken and crossed over the chest. A coffin that showed clear signs of having been opened and ray-sealed. For years, these might be dismissed as anomalies, the work of clumsy grave diggers or strange, isolated burial custom. It wasn't until historians and folklorists started digging through old town records, diaries, and newspaper archives and connecting their findings with the archaeological evidence that the true story began to be pieced back together. They were, in a sense, exhuming the memory of the panic itself, uncovering the story that the communities had tried so hard to bury. So, as you stand in the quiet, modern town, you can feel the weight of that silence. The old graveyard is still there on the hill, but the headstones are worn and tilted. The names are faded. It looks peaceful, serene. But you know that beneath that peaceful surface lies a history of incredible trauma and fear, a story of a time when the barrier between the living and the dead felt terrifyingly thin, a story that the town itself did everything in its power to forget. The story of the panic doesn't just fade into silent shame, it has a final, dramatic postscript. One last, well-documented case that serves as a grim closing chapter to this strange era. It's the most famous of all the New England vampire incidents, and it happened much later than you might think, in 1892. A full decade after Robert Koch had identified the tuberculosis bacillus. This is the story of Mercy Brown. The setting is Exeter, Rhode Island, a small rural town. The family is the Browns, headed by a farmer named George Brown. Like so many families before him, George watched his family get consumed by the disease. First, his wife Mary died. Then, 2 years later, his eldest daughter, Mary Olive, also succumbed. They were buried in the local Baptist church cemetery. The curse seemed to have passed. But then, George's only son, Edwin, who had moved away for work, came home sick with the familiar, wasting illness. He was getting worse. And at the same time, his younger sister, a 19-year-old girl named Mercy Lena Brown, also fell ill. She declined rapidly and died in January of 1892. Now George Brown was facing the extinction of his entire family line. His neighbors, steeped in the old folklore and terrified that the Brown curse might spread to their own families, began to pressure him. They urged him to consider the old remedy. They told him that one of his deceased family members must be the cause, that one of them was, in their words, preying on the living Edwin. George Brown was, by all accounts, a reluctant participant. He was a practical farmer, and the idea sounded like foolish superstition to him. But he was also a desperate father, watching his only son die. Under immense pressure from his community, he finally gave in. He consented to the exhumation. On a cold day in March 1892, a group of men, including a local doctor and a correspondent from the Providence Journal, went to the cemetery. Their plan was to exhume the bodies of all 3 deceased Brown women, the mother, the first daughter, and Mercy, to see which one was the vampire. First, they opened the graves of the mother, Mary, and the older daughter, Mary Olive. Both had been dead for several years, and their bodies showed the expected signs of advanced decomposition. They were essentially skeletons, nothing amiss there. Then they opened the grave of Mercy Brown. She had only been dead for 2 months, and it had been a cold New England winter. The ground was frozen, and her body had been kept in an above-ground crypt for a time before burial. When they opened her coffin, they found exactly what the folklore predicted. Her body was remarkably well preserved. There was, according to the eyewitness accounts, blood-liquefied organs in her heart and liver. To the terrified men, this was the undeniable sign. The quiet 19-year-old girl was the culprit. This event is a perfect storm of all the elements of the panic. You have a family devastated by an identifiable disease, a community gripped by folk belief, and the tragic misinterpretation of natural decomposition. A particularly poignant and bizarre deed is that the Dr. Harold Metcalf, actually tried to explain to the men that Mercy's state of preservation was normal given the cold conditions. He offered a scientific explanation. They had their proof. The folklore was more powerful than the doctor's science. The ritual that followed was the classic one. They cut out Mercy Brown's heart and liver. They carried the organs to a nearby rock, built a fire, and burned them to ashes. Then they mixed the ashes with water and gave the potion to the dying Edwin to drink as a last, desperate cure. It did not work. Edwin died 2 months later. But because a newspaper reporter was present, the story of Mercy Brown did not get buried in shame and silence. It became a national sensation. Newspapers across America, from Boston to San Francisco, ran the story, often under lurid headlines like Vampire in New England. The story of the quiet Rhode Island farm girl became the definitive, most famous example of the panic. Historians are still fascinated by the Mercy Brown case. It serves as the perfect encapsulation of the conflict at the heart of this entire saga, the clash between the emerging scientific worldview and the persistent, deeply rooted folk beliefs. It happened so late in the day at a time when the world was supposed to be moving on from such things. It proves how long these ideas could hold on, especially in isolated communities gripped by fear. Mercy Brown, in a sad and strange way, became the last official American vampire. Her story is the final, tragic echo of a long and terrifying panic. The story of the panic and of Mercy Brown doesn't just end with her brother's death and the subsequent newspaper headlines. It seeps into the cultural soil of New England and, from there, into the wider world of American fiction. The memory that was so actively suppressed by the communities themselves found a new, disguised life in the world of ghost stories and Gothic literature. The real-life horror was too raw to confront directly, but it could be explored safely through the lens of fiction. You can almost picture it. A writer in Providence or Boston reads the sensational newspaper account of the Mercy Brown case. He is fascinated by the sheer Gothic horror of it, happening not in some distant, gloomy European castle, but right there, in the supposedly rational, modern landscape of America. The story plants a seed in his imagination. He can write about the Browns' direct journalism, but he can take the core elements, the wasting sickness, the belief that the dead are preying on the living, the grim exhumation, the desecration of the grave. This is very likely what happened with one of the most famous figures in American horror literature, P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft lived in Providence, Rhode Island, and was a voracious reader of local history and strange news. The Mercy Brown incident happened just a few miles from his home, and it was a major local news story during his youth. It's almost certain that he knew the tale well. While Lovecraft never wrote a story in the traditional sense, the themes and imagery of the New England panic echo throughout his work. In his 1924 short story The Shunned House, the plot revolves around a family that is slowly wasting away, generation after generation, due to a malevolent presence buried in the cellar of their home. The monster is a mysterious, fungus-like entity that drains the life force of the living. The solution, undertaken by the story's protagonist, involves digging into the earth of the cellar to find and destroy the source. It's not a one-to-one retelling, but the core structure: a mysterious wasting disease, a generational curse, and a solution that involves exhumation and destruction is a direct echo of the real-life panics. Another, less direct, line of influence can be traced to the master of New England Gothic, Nathaniel Hawthorne. Writing a few decades before the Mercy Brown case but during the peak of the consumption epidemic, Hawthorne was obsessed with the themes of hidden sin, inherited curses, and the dark secrets lurking beneath the respectable surface of New England society. In his novel The House of the Seven Gables, a family is haunted by the curse of its ancestor, leading to a slow, inexorable decay. While not a vampire story, it taps into the same cultural anxiety, the idea that the past is not deadened, that the sins of the ancestors can physically manifest as sickness and misfortune in the present. The quirky but telling detail is how the American vampire in fiction differs from its European cousin. The classic European vampire, like Dracula, is an aristocrat, an outsider who invades a community. The New England vampire, both in reality and in the fiction it inspired, is the opposite. It is an insider. It's your own sister, your mother, your neighbor. The horror is domestic, intimate. The monster is not another, it is us. This makes the horror, in some ways, even more disturbing. The threat isn't coming from outside the fortress, it's already inside the walls, sitting at your dinner table, buried in your own family plot. Historians who study the intersection of folklore and literature are still tracing these connections. They debate how much writers like Lovecraft were consciously drawing on specific cases like Mercy Brown's verses, how much they were simply absorbing the general, ambient dread of the region's folklore. The answer is probably a bit of both. The vampire panic became part of the psychic landscape of New England, a kind of cultural ghost that haunted the region's imagination long after the actual rituals had ceased. So while the farmers and townspeople were trying their best to forget, the writers and storytellers were doing the opposite. They were preserving the memory, transforming the raw, painful history into myth. They took the fear, the grief, and the desperation and spun it into a new kind of folklore, ensuring that the strange, sad story of America's real vampire hunt would never be completely buried. The panic died out in the real world, but it found a permanent, restless home in the pages of horror fiction. So here we are at the end of our journey. We've traveled from a quiet, candlelit farmhouse to a windswept graveyard, and through the strange, murky territory where fear and love get twisted together. We've seen how a real, microscopic killer could be transformed by the human mind into a gothic monster, and how the belief could do terrible things in the name of survival. What's the final takeaway from this forgotten chapter of history? It's a story about a specific time and a specific disease. Yes, but it's also about something more universal, the anatomy of a panic. First, you need the perfect breeding ground. In our story, it was the isolated, tight-knit communities of New England. These were places where everyone knew each other, where a single family's tragedy was everyone's business, and where social pressure was an immense force. This closeness, normally a source of strength, became a conduit for fear. Second, you need a mysterious and terrifying threat that the authorities can't seem to handle. For them, it was consumption. It was a slow, relentless killer that science and medicine, in their 19th century forms, were powerless to stop. This failure of the experts created a vacuum of authority, a space where alternative explanations could rush in. Third, you need a compelling pre-existing narrative to fill that vacuum. The old European folktales of the restless dead, the Natch Zara, the life-draining corpse, these were the perfect fit. The story was already there, lying dormant in the cultural memory, just waiting for the right crisis to reactivate it. It offered a simple, powerful explanation for an inexplicable horror. It wasn't a random disease, it was an attack. Fourth, you need evidence. And as we saw, the natural, grotesque processes of decomposition provided all the proof a terrified, grief-stricken mind could ever need. The bloated body, the liquid blood in the heart, these weren't seen as natural phenomena, but as supernatural confirmations. The belief didn't just create the ritual, it interpreted the physical world to justify it. And finally, you need a vector for transmission. The stories spread through word of mouth, from one panicked family to another, and ironically, through the very newspapers that claimed to be debunking the superstition. The panic behaved like a contagion itself. A virus of fear passed through stories. A final, weird little piece of this puzzle is the name itself. Did the people of 19th century New England actually use the word vampire? The historical record is mixed. In their own diaries and letters, they often used more vague terms, speaking of the dead feeding on the living or being unqueed in the grave. The word vampire, with all its literary, Gothic baggage, was more often used by outsiders than newspaper reporters and urban commentators who were looking for a sensationalist label. The academic debate over the terminology continues, but it highlights a key point: we might be imposing our own monster movie vocabulary on a set of beliefs that were more homespun, more intimate, and in some ways more tragic. They weren't hunting Dracula, they were trying to stop Aunt Lucy. Looking back from our modern vantage point, it's easy to judge these people. It's easy to call them ignorant or barbaric. But that's a luxury we have, standing on this side of the germ theory of disease. If you were in their shoes watching your entire family wither and die from something no one could explain, what would you do when reason fails, when medicine fails, when prayer seems to fail? The human mind will reach for any story, any ritual, any desperate hope that offers even a sliver of control in the face of chaos. The New England vampire panic is a humbling reminder of that. It's a story about how love for family can lead to the desecration of a family member's grave. It's a story about how the fear of the unknown can be more powerful than reason, faith, and even the law. It's a ghost story, yes, but the ghosts are not just the dead in the graveyard. They are the ghosts of fear, of ignorance, and of a desperate, terrifying time when the line between the natural and the supernatural was not just blurry, but fatally erased. And now the story is over. The frantic digging has ceased, the whispers have faded away. The cold, sharp air of 19th century New England begins to soften, to dissolve into the warm quiet of your own room. Feel the weight of that history lifting, leaving behind only a faint echo, like a story you heard a long, long time ago. The anxieties of that world, the desperate choices made in the flickering candlelight, are not your own. They belong to the past, a past that is now drifting away, like smoke from a dying hearth. You can let it go. Imagine the screen of your mind, where those stark images played out, now growing softened out of focus. The harsh lines of the stone walls, the grim faces in the lantern light, the stark white of the church steeple, they all blur and blend, losing their sharp edges. The sounds, too, begin to fade. The relentless coughing, the scrape of the shovel, the hiss of the fire, they recede into a deepened, profound silence, replaced by the gentle, steady rhythm of your own breathing, easy rise and fall of your breath. In and out, your own bed is here, a safe harbor in the quiet is here. There are no restless spirits. There are no restless spirits. There is only the soft weight of your blanket, the gentle support of your pillow. You are safe. You are at peace. You are at peace. The long journey into that fearful past is complete, and you have returned, leaving those old fears behind where they belong. You can allow your thoughts to drift now, unmoored from the story, letting them float freely into the vast, quiet space of oncoming sleep. Let the darkness be a comfort, a soft blanket for your mind. It's time to rest. The end of the article. Good night.